The exhibition is called Rituals, New Sculptures by me, Tim Pomeroy. And I thought it would be quite useful to start with this piece here, just to kind of key into the roadmap of where some of the other sculptures that I'll discuss later on might take you. Because I think this little piece, quite bijou piece, it kind of informs some of the other pieces that I'll talk about later on, because one sculpture, in my practice, one sculpture seems to evolve into another sculpture. So an idea kind of evolves and changes, and sometimes the changes are very slight, sometimes they're very major, but there's always a kind of genetic thread running through them, I think. Occasionally I'll take a jump off and do something quite different, but that's why I want to start with this one. This is called Wings. A few years back, I made a sculpture based on the notion of wings. I think it's very plain to see, sort of the sense of uplift. And what that did was, it gave me this very lovely shape with this circle in the middle and this slot. And inside that, there's a kind of dynamic that I really enjoy. These lines, this wedge shape at the top, this wedge-shaped void at the top. So there's something about the sculpture that really kind of locked into me, and actually it goes on to inform some of the other pieces that I'll talk about later on. It's about uplift, it's about hope, I think. That's why it's kind of bright and shiny. That might sound a bit kind of superficial, but it's not. It's about bright and shiny, it's about uplift. So in that sense, it's quite hopeful. And I think that kind of, the emotional effect a sculpture has is something that very much drives my practice. First of all, I'm mainly a stone carver, primarily a stone carver, and use materials that I hope are sympathetic to the ideas that I'm trying to illustrate. So for instance, this is native Arran granite. It comes from the island where I live. It's a lovely honey-coloured granite. And behind me, black granite, again, it's Indian granite. It's got a very particular finish. Finishing is, as I suppose any sculptor would tell you, that the finishing, you can get down to the form of a sculpture quite quickly, but it's the finishing that takes all the time. Polishing granite, polishing marble, it's just an endless task. This piece here, I live right next to the sea, literally the sea is at the bottom of my garden. So I spend a lot of time wandering around, sort of looking at rock pools, looking at the shoreline, looking at stuff, and turning over rocks and finding creatures and sea anemones and so on. There's a thing that scuttles away under the rocks called a coat of male chitin. The coat of male chitin has informed this idea, as have things like sea squirts and sea cucumbers and corals and all sorts of things, the things that I see down on the shoreline. As I said, I can't tell you what the sculpture is. The sculpture is itself, it is the sculpture. But what I can say is that it's a kind of conflation of all sorts of influences, some of which may be simply the colour of the stone, some of them may be the coat of male chitin, or the shrimp, or the rhythms in the sand. You'll see as we go around the exhibition that I'm very attracted to kind of these sort of lines, these sort of rhythms, and they crop up again and again and again. You can see them here. There's something I find very satisfying about that rhythm and the different ways that I can portray that rhythm. In this one, it's done in kind of scalloped cuts that I could almost fit my fingers in. And this one is done on angled plates. But the rhythm remains the same. And these rhythms I see very much coming from nature. They're all in nature, whether it's the waves left on the sand when the tide goes out, or the way rock is eroded, or the way a tree is eroded, or the way that the rings of a tree are laid down. All these rhythms are there, and I, rightly or wrongly, tie in, and I'm moved by these rhythms. This piece here was a direct result of this notion of wings. But what I did in my mind was I elongated it so that it gave it even more of a sense of uplift. So the sculpture, the original sculpture that started as wings was perfectly circular. When you looked at it from the side, there was other dynamics. There were wedge forms and dynamics that went through it. But as I did drawings of the sculpture and I suppose extruded it, if I was a machine, I kind of extruded the idea, and it gave it even more of a sense of uplift and actually a sense of purpose. So having a point at the top, you have that sort of sense of particular purpose. The dynamism, as opposed to the other piece, comes from the epicenter being in this void. So all these irradiating lines are irradiating from this invisible point, the point that I cut out of the sculpture after I drew the lines on. And that gives it a kind of inner, for me, an inner energy. There's a kind of inner energy irradiating from the centre and spreading up. I find it very exciting. This piece, which is quite minimalist, is made in Cumbrian slate, which I believe the miners used to call it metal stone or steel stone, because actually it finishes almost like a metal. Years and years and years ago, I made a sculpture in Cumbrian slate that was a kind of conflation of two ideas. It was, on the one hand, it was a projectile like the head of a bullet or an artillery shell, but the shape had been splayed in such a way that it had also incorporated a bishop's mitre, so it was a kind of slamming together of these two ideas. Now both of these things have a kind of a notion of power about them. These new sculptures, one of the things that at the back of my mind I was thinking about were these Mayan headdresses, these headdresses, and also headdresses from ancient Egyptian bas-relief carvings. So there is that notion put into these as well. So to look at these, I would hope that something of that intention came over, as well as just the dynamism of the finish. There's a kind of sensuality about it that is something that I search for all the way through. That sensuality only begins to come really as the finishing of the sculptures. I begin to polish it, and the polishing goes through various different stages. You have in this one, you have a kind of eggshell stage, but the finer the diamonds or the carborundum that one uses, the more shiny the surface becomes. So consequently with the Black King, which is a black granite piece, I'm polishing up to sort of what in the trade is called 3000 grit. So it's very, very highly polished. But what that does to the touch is it gives a kind of sensuality, as does this. That's part of, for me anyway, it's part of the enjoyment of the sculpture, is being able to touch it. My practice has been informed over 10 years, maybe longer, by archaeology, things being dug up in a very non-academic way. I make no claim to know about history or archaeology. I'm very moved by objects, as I was when I was a wee boy, when my mother took me to the Kelvin Grove and I looked at fragments of Egyptology, and it was like yeast in my imagination. One of the things that I was looking at a few years back were a thing called torques, which are these kind of golden necklaces which have this very particular shape. Last year I made a sculpture called By Moon and Sun, which was directly related to this. It had echoes of one of the pieces downstairs, of lines irradiating from the centre of the sculpture and going to the outside. So it had this sense of uplift and this sense of an epicentre, an energy epicentre. And as I said perhaps earlier, that one idea feeds another idea. I'm one of these people who finds it much easier to have a continuum of ideas rather than to stop working and then hope that another idea one day will just sort of suddenly manifest itself. I think that it's a much more natural way to be constantly working, and then one idea suggests another idea, a modification, a modulation, a slight change, and so on and so on and so on. That's how I work. The torque idea became the signature piece for this exhibition, called Ritual Vessel. But the title of the exhibition, this title sculpture, Ritual Vessel, has this torque-like feel. And when I made it, I looked at it and then decided to make another version in black granite because I like this lens. You might not be able to see it on the camera, but it's got a lens-shaped profile. So there's a very, very subtle coming and going of this form, which in its own way might be difficult to see, makes this very interesting crescent. The interior of this crescent is incredibly interesting and sensuous. And then ultimately when I made it, and I didn't want to polish this piece right up to the finish that I have in perhaps one or two of the other pieces, I wanted to leave this in a kind of eggshell feel. So that's how this all came about. It relates to Torques, it relates to the signature piece from the exhibition, but it also relates to a kind of an interest I have in the night sky. I live on Arran. The night sky is incredibly clear. It's as clear as you'll get it anywhere, I reckon, in the world. While I'm here, I would just like to show you, this is a very exciting development for me, and this is a book that's published by Stephen Morris Photography, and it's being launched today to coincide with this exhibition, and this was Stephen's initiative, and it's been basically in preparation for the last 6 months or so, and it's an illustrated biography of my kind of work to date, and it's available here at the Fine Arts. I'm delighted with it. It's fantastic. How many times in one's life can one say one has had a book written about one? There we are. I've said it.